Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing mic check. Sounding good? All right. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing mic check.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for attending today's hearing. The civil and political rights in Uzbekistan and Central Asia, implications for post-2014 U.S. foreign policy. I would like to welcome our distinguished witnesses who are leading efforts in the United States government and civil society to promote human rights in Central Asia. I would also like to thank the staff of the Commission for organizing this important hearing. Today's focus on civil and political freedoms in Uzbekistan and Central Asia comes at a timely moment. With the withdrawal of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, we have an opportunity to make human rights a priority in U.S. foreign policy towards the region. While Central Asian states have been key partners in providing logistical and operational support to U.S. troops in Afghanistan, the exigencies of the war have overshadowed serious human rights abuses occurring in all 5 countries. These abuses must be brought to light and addressed because they also represent a serious threat to long-term security and prosperity in the region. All the Central Asian states, to varying degrees, systematically deny their citizens fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Uzbekistan's authoritarian government routinely detains and tortures human rights activists, journalists, religious believers, artists, and other perceived critics of the government. According to some international human rights observers, thousands of people are imprisoned on politically motivated charges. Turkmenistan and Tajikistan and Kazakhstan are also ruled by authoritarian regimes that restrict freedoms of speech, press, association, and religion, and deny due process of law. Very little progress has been made towards creating open and accountable governments that protect basic rights. While Kyrgyzstan has a more democratic form of government, it is at risk of reversing this progress as its legislature continues measures that would restrict the space for civil society, including a prohibition on free speech for those promoting more positive attitudes towards non-traditional sexual relations. In the next phase of our foreign policy towards Central Asia, it is important that we seriously engage with the region's governments to improve the poor human rights conditions in each country. Respect for human rights, including the right of citizens to express their grievances and peacefully advocate for changes in or with their government, is the best strategy to address the security challenges we face today. History has shown us again and again that internal repression makes countries vulnerable to instability, extremism, and conflict. So we're here today to discuss and explore ways the United States can contribute to promoting civil and political rights in Uzbekistan and the wider Central Asian region. I look forward to hearing your analysis and recommendations, and at this point I'd like to turn it over to our co-chair, Congressman Joe Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your work on this important hearing on human rights climate in Central Asia. And I would also like to thank our witnesses for their participation here today. In recent years, U.S. foreign policy towards Central Asia was largely influenced by our nation's security interest and military strategy in Afghanistan. As troop presence in Afghanistan decreases, it is integral that the United States broadens our foreign policy strategy to address civil and political stability in the region. Central Asian leaders have expressed their commitment to democratization, but little progress has been made to liberalize their political systems or increase protection of human rights and free expression of their citizens. And while each country presents a particular set of civil and political challenges, to some extent in all the Central Asian countries, they have human rights abuses of varying degrees. The United States State Department has reported restrictions on freedom of speech, press, religion, association, and assembly, lack of independent judiciaries, arbitrary application of justice, and abuses by law enforcement and government officials. Human rights groups report particularly egregious abuses against citizens, including detention, extortion, torture, and targeted violent attacks on the basis of ethnicity, religion, gender, and political party. Further, the region is recognized as a breeding zone for human trafficking, with many of these countries serving as the source, transit point, and destination for countless men, women, and children subject to forced labor or sex trafficking. And I believe it is easy to observe that where political and civil rights suffer, other abuses of human rights are sure to follow. And the region's record, or their record on human trafficking is a sad reflection of that fact. As we witness the continued oppression and abuse of increasingly authoritative regimes, there's evidence of increased radicalization and security threats within civil society. Recent reports on Islamic State foreign fighters suggest a surge in militants from Central Asia joining the ranks of ISIS fighters in Iraq and Syria. The Helsinki Commission, on which I serve, recently observed this issue, and I believe that a lack of respect for human rights can also contribute to this bursting and disturbing dynamic. Since the September 11th terrorist attack, our government's policy towards the region recalibrated to focus on three issues: the promotion of security, domestic reforms, and energy development. The governments in this region have all backed U.S. efforts on the war of terror to some varying degrees. Much of this support culminated in the U.S. coalition's reliance on the Northern Distribution Network. The continued importance of regional stability continues to merit strong relations with the United States. However, as we witness the ongoing withdrawal of American forces from the immediate region, I'm afraid that our ability to advocate for gains in the issue of domestic reforms may suffer. Last year, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper stated that the greatest risk to regional stability is long-standing internal governance issues, not external military threats. I would echo the importance that internal governance will have not just a regional stability, but on economic development, energy development, and the very vitality of the region. So with that, I look forward to the insight of our panels and their recommendations for improving the human rights climate, and would offer my willingness to continue to work with these governments in fostering a mutually beneficial and collaborative relationship with the United States government. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I want to yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for a brief statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the co-chairs of this commission, you, Mr. McGovern, and Mr. Pitts, for calling this very timely and important hearing. Central Asia is not always at the top of many people's minds, but it's of tremendous importance to the long-term security interests of the United States. I want to begin by recognizing that the Andijan massacre in 2005, during which hundreds of civilians were brutally murdered by Uzbek security forces, remains a stain on the governors of Uzbekistan and indeed on the international community, as we've been unable to secure an independent investigation that would begin to lead to justice or closure for the families of the hundreds of innocent civilians who were killed. I want to reaffirm unequivocally that this issue should remain at the top of U.S. relations with Uzbekistan, and I urge the government of President Karimov to allow access for an independent international inquiry so that the victims and their families may have justice. As we deal with a variety of foreign policy issues such as crises in the Middle East, the thawing of relations with Cuba, securing a nuclear agreement with Iran, the small countries of Central Asia can sometimes be forgotten, but they're vitally important in a number of ways. First, Central Asia has the dubious honor of being one of the world's most repressive regions. All but one, Kyrgyzstan, are determined to be not free by Freedom House. And in fact, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan consistently rank among the, quote, worst of the worst, Freedom House list of the world's worst human rights violators. At the same time, many of these countries have played or continue to play a role in supporting the United States military efforts in South Asia, meaning that the United States engages them on a variety of issues beyond the human rights sphere. However, this can also afford an opportunity to push on human rights issues, though our success has been mixed. With Uzbekistan expelling U.S. forces after we pressed for an inquiry into the Andijan massacre, while on the other hand, in Kyrgyzstan, there have been some positive democratic developments, though much remains to be achieved. While the countries of Central Asia have different political systems, ethnic populations, and international leanings, the fact remains that each of them continues to face serious human rights issues that must be addressed. I'm particularly interested in hearing from the witnesses on two issues that are tied together: Russia's ongoing negative influence on the laws and governance in the region of Central Asia, and in particular how that influence has led to attempts to target the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities in these countries. The government of Vladimir Putin holds great sway over many of the Central Asian republics, all of which were created after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Most concerning are the Central Asian countries' attempts to adopt homophobic or xenophobic laws criminalizing propaganda, supporting same-sex or non-traditional relations, and stigmatizing international NGOs as foreign agents. The international community has had some success in pushing back on the anti-homosexuality laws. Kazakhstan's Constitutional Council struck a proposed law down earlier this year. However, Kyrgyzstan is still considering their own anti-homosexual law as well as targeting civil society. Even where bad legislation has been struck down, the fact remains that the LGBT communities in Central Asia remain marginalized, sometimes criminalized, and are exposed to high levels of violence, harassment, and discrimination. I'd very much like to hear from our witnesses about the efforts being made by the United States government on the ground in these countries to promote the rights of LGBT communities, as well as what more can be done at multilateral institutions to move these countries in the right direction. Moreover, given the difficult operating environment and the overwhelming need for human rights reforms, how is the United States government engaging at the government level, but also with civil society, to promote the freedoms of expression, assembly, association, and religion? I again thank the two co-chairs for calling this hearing. I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses. And thank you for being here today. And with that, I yield back, Mr.
Well, thank you very much. And with that, I would like to introduce our first panel of witnesses from the Department of State. I am pleased to welcome Mr. Daniel Rosenblum, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central Asia in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, and Mr. Rob Bershinsky, Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Both bureaus have shared leadership in promoting human rights in Central Asia, and I'm eager to hear about your efforts, progress, and challenges in engaging in the region. Mr. Rosenblum, welcome, and why don't you begin?
Thank you very much, Co-Chairman, all members of the Commission. Thanks for holding this hearing today on the state of civil and political rights in Central Asia. Hearings like this one help to amplify our values and our message to both governments and the people of Central Asia. We're also grateful for the many letters from members of Congress to governments of the region which shine a spotlight on certain prisoner cases or express concern about policies and legislation that restrict internationally recognized human rights. We also appreciate your efforts here in Washington and the time that you and your staff take to travel to Central Asia, talk with the region's officials, journalists, and human rights defenders, and let them know what we stand for and why it matters. Now I'd like to briefly review the U.S. government's policy priorities in Central Asia, and then I'll go into a few country specifics. This is a region of secular governments and mainly Muslim populations that are valuable partners in countering terrorism, violent extremism, trafficking, and weapons proliferation. This is a region that borders Russia, China, Iran, and, of course, Afghanistan, where we have spent a lot of blood and treasure. And we see Central Asia as a key to Afghanistan's future stability and success. And this is a region whose natural resources and trade routes can help drive economic growth in Asia and beyond. And so, for all these reasons, we're engaged in this region, and our strategy there has three main objectives. The first is to develop strong security partnerships, especially related to counterterrorism and border security. The second is to build a foundation for inclusive prosperity by helping each of the countries integrate into the global rules-based trading system, as exemplified by the WTO, while improving economic linkages within the region and with its neighbors in South Asia and in Europe. The third objective is to promote internal political and economic reform, especially accountable governance and rule of law. Respect for human rights is at the core of all three objectives, and our constant message to each state in Central Asia is that sustained stability and prosperity cannot be achieved through intimidation, suppression, and corrupt governance. In fact, such tactics are short-sighted and counterproductive to the long-term interests of any country. What's more, if a state does not respect human rights, the rule of law, and accountable governance, We, the United States, are limited in what we can achieve in our relations with them, whether it be in the political, economic, or security spheres. So it's really in everyone's interest that these countries improve their records on human rights and thereby achieve the full potential for bilateral cooperation with the U.S. That's our common message to the countries of the region. However, the 5 Central Asian countries are not a single undifferentiated group. They are 5 individual states, each with its own political and economic trajectory. Reflecting this fact, the human rights situation is also different in each country. Kyrgyzstan is a functioning parliamentary democracy, though its parliament is currently considering legislation that would punish expressions of LGBT identity and limit civil society organizations. Kazakhstan has upheld some of its international human rights obligations, but is also placing undue pressure on political opposition, independent media, and some religious groups it deems non-traditional to Kazakhstan. Tajikistan has made limited progress on human rights, and we have expressed serious concerns about its policies on political competition, independent media, and religious freedom. As for Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, there is not much on the positive side of the human rights ledger, while the negative balance is quite high. We're working hard to improve the situation. Our ambassadors in each country and our officials here in Washington and at the OSCE in Vienna raise these issues at the highest levels and on a regular basis. Human rights are a part of every major conversation. And our diplomatic efforts have achieved some results. Take labor rights as an example, which is a foundation for a strong and resilient economy. Turkmenistan has worked to eliminate forced child labor from its annual cotton harvest, though adult forced labor remains a serious concern. And after several years of effort and work with us and others, Uzbekistan has mostly eradicated state-sponsored forced child labor in its cotton sector and is now working with the ILO and the World Bank on addressing adult forced labor. There is obviously far, far more that needs improvement, but efforts like these are a start. We also know that dialogue alone is not enough. So with congressional support, we also have assistance programs that promote the rule of law, independent judiciaries, and economic opportunities for disadvantaged groups, just to name a few. These programs will not change things overnight, but they can have positive impacts and help build the capacity for improved conditions down the road. Strengthening civil and political rights in Central Asia is a top priority for us, and we're thankful that we have the U.S. Congress as a vocal and effective partner. The situation is a challenging one and not likely to change quickly or easily. We have no doubts about that. But we believe that through consistent, specific, and patient engagement with the governments and people of the Central Asian states, we can enhance prospects for long-term stability in the region, develop a more solid basis for mutually beneficial government-to-government ties, and improve the lives of the people of Central Asia. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brzezinski.
Thank you. Chairman McGovern, Co-Chairman Pitts, members of the Commission, it's an honor to be here speaking with you today on the human rights situation in Central Asia. I assumed my current position 3 weeks ago, having most recently come from the U.S. mission to the United Nations, where I had the privilege of working under a staunch advocate for human dignity and Ambassador Samantha Power, and witnessed on a daily basis the importance of principled U.S. leadership. I'm proud to be able to carry with me these lessons to the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I want to begin my remarks by reiterating a critical point that Des Rosenblum just made, which is that protection and promotion of human rights and freedoms are essential to security and stability in the Central Asia region. Restrictive governance and heavy-handed tactics risk fueling social grievances that catalyze the very security threats that both we and the Central Asian governments seek to address. Central Asian governments are particularly anxious about external geopolitical developments, from instability in Afghanistan to pressure from Russia. These uncertainties have led the region's governments to accelerate efforts to neutralize independent and opposition voices they had already deemed threatening to the stability of their regimes. For this reason, now more than ever, the people of Central Asia feel that the true added value of continued U.S. engagement is that we promote principles that other partners will not. Most importantly, the respect for their individual rights and freedoms is an integral corollary to and component of our cooperation in other respects. So while we work with the countries of the region in a number of areas, as you just heard, we continue to call for political reforms and for the region's governments to respect the universal rights of their citizens, as well as for an end to corrupt governance. Only when these conditions are met will the Central Asian states truly provide their peoples with the free, prosperous, and secure societies that they deserve. With this as context, I want to briefly discuss various areas of concern, providing a few illustrative examples, and then turn to our diplomatic efforts and, in some cases, successes. First, with respect to religious freedom and the interrelated issue of countering violent extremism, a significant area of concern is the intensification of heavy-handed policies, including detentions, tortures, and punishment of peaceful religious activities and expression under the guise of countering extremism. These policies generate a cycle of repression that breeds radicalization, which in turn breeds further repression. And so the United States is using every opportunity we have, as I will early next week when I travel to Astana for a regional countering violent extremism conference, to highlight that violent extremists do not need freedom of religion to conduct their activities, but rather the Central Asian people require it to be an effective bulwark against violent extremism. Turning to political space and recent elections, we know meaningful participation in free, fair, transparent electoral processes, including space for opposition, is a key part of a healthy pluralistic democracy. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, these processes are largely denied in the region. Recently, we have seen severely problematic elections, including in Uzbekistan, where a March 29 presidential election not only convened the constitutional limit of 2 consecutive presidential terms, but lacked genuine political alternatives and involved restrictions on freedoms of expression and association. Similarly, Tajikistan's March 1st parliamentary elections were neither free nor fair. And finally, Kazakhstan's April 26 snap presidential elections lacked political alternatives and took place within a restricted media environment that stifled public debate and freedom of expression. We have also seen tighter limitations on the operating space for independent civil society and the media throughout the region, including through the introduction of legislation aimed at restricting the activities of NGOs. This is extremely troublesome, especially at a time when civil society should be assisting governments in the region in addressing unprecedented socioeconomic challenges. Following Moscow's lead, Kyrgyzstan has introduced a draft, quote, foreign agents law that, if it moves forward, threatens to greatly curtail civil society and damage Kyrgyzstan's reputation as a democratic country. In Kazakhstan, the government enacted a criminal code that sharply increases the range of offenses and gravity of criminal punishments for civil society. Draft legislation introduced late last year seeks to establish a government, quote, operator to control funding to NGOs. And after meaningful U.S. engagement, we recently learned that the government of Kazakhstan has revised the draft criminal code and will not regulate private or foreign funding to NGOs, yet this is a situation that we're monitoring very closely. With respect to restrictions on media, in Uzbekistan, we have long-standing concerns about the lack of space for free, independent media and the very real threats to journalists who undertake this essential work. In Tajikistan, there are continued reports of blocked web content and telecommunications during politically sensitive periods, an issue I raised and discussed with the Tajikistani delegation during an annual bilateral conference 2 weeks ago at great length. And in Turkmenistan, the government enforces censorship and continues to subject journalists to growing harassment and surveillance. Political disenfranchisement is compounded by rampant corruption in the region, which isolates a wide swath of citizens from resources and undermines the impact of foreign investment. Corruption in Central Asia has a direct impact on the prosperity of the region's people. Without robust democratic institutions and strong rule of law, as well as respect for labor rights and space for the free exchange of information, Central Asia's huge economic potential, which we just heard about, cannot be fully realized. Finally, further constraining the breadth of our bilateral and regional cooperation with the Central Asian states are continued reports of systemic abuse and ill treatment of citizens by state security forces. It is imperative that military and police forces effectively prevent and account for human rights violations that have undermined public trust and security. As a step towards broader security and justice sector reform, we have called upon the region's governments to grant unobstructed access by relevant UN special mandate holders and other third-party monitors such as the ICRC. In Uzbekistan, for instance, at least 11 UN special mandate holders have outstanding entry requests to which the government has not responded. Given this clearly difficult operating environment, we continue to call, both publicly and privately, for political reform in Central Asia, recognizing that it is both a moral and strategic imperative for the United States to work, however painstakingly, towards a democratic, rights-respecting region. We make these calls frequently and at the highest levels, and will continue to do so until we see meaningful change. We also make clear to regional governments that we could do more through our bilateral relations in the security sector, in the economic realm, and through people-to-people exchanges if these governments would undertake meaningful reform and improve their human rights landscapes. To that end, we make use of individual meetings and annual bilateral consultations to have frank discussions that set the stage for many other engagements we pursue over the course of the year, as well as our assistance programming. As you heard, we've seen a modicum of progress in certain corners of the region. For example, we are pleased to see the progress Uzbekistan has made in working with the ILO on forced child labor in its cotton sector. In Tajikistan, we have repeatedly raised a problematic law on public associations, and the Ministry of Justice has modified the law with language that we hope will protect NGOs from some of the scrutiny and interference they may have otherwise faced. And in Turkmenistan, where frankly there isn't much to celebrate, we have repeatedly raised the issue of religious freedom with the government, and several prisoners of conscience have subsequently been released late last year and early this year. In conclusion, we intend to build on these small improvements by speaking plainly to the Central Asian governments and offering the view that it is in our, as well as their, best interest to promote their people's rights and freedoms while addressing credible security threats. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, and I appreciate your statements and appreciate all that you do. I have a few questions. You know, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are led by aging rulers of questionable human rights records, to say the least. Does anyone think that political succession in these countries is likely to impact the human rights situation? Are there people on deck that we think are more promising or will be more sensitive to the issues of human rights issues than these guys?
Congressman, thanks for that question. I'll start off, and my colleague can supplement later. But first of all, I think it's hard to predict exactly what impact succession might have in domestic situation, and I don't want to get too deeply into hypothetical or speculative. But I will say that presidential succession is of course an important issue in any country. And if it's not managed properly, there's a risk of instability resulting from the struggles, which could actually compromise human rights interests. And it's for that reason that we remain so deeply engaged in Central Asia through our embassies and through our constant engagement. And there's no doubt that this question of succession is absolutely key to the future of countries in the region, and particularly the two that you mentioned. And for that reason, we stress the importance of engagement at all levels of society and government too, because we want to have partners and friends in all corners of these countries. So that's what I would say. Rob, you want to?
If I could just add, I think what history shows us is that succession planning is incredibly difficult in authoritarian situations, in large part because those environments are characterized around individuals and not institutions. And so by nature, in these situations, institutions are weak. And so that's why a lot of our work goes into attempting and recognizing how difficult this is in the context of the two countries you mentioned, on strengthening institutions and suggesting improvements to problematic political processes. And just to tee off of what Des Rosenblum just mentioned, that's why we're focused on engagement with the people of these countries and doing what we can to support them.
I appreciate that. It doesn't sound very optimistic. I'm not saying that you're not hopeful, but I mean, I don't think we should all be waiting to expect that whoever succeeds them are somehow going to change things very dramatically without other factors coming to play. Let me ask you a question about U.S. foreign assistance and security cooperation. Recently, the United States provided Uzbekistan with over 300 MRAPs. Could somebody explain the rationale for the initiative, given Uzbekistan's human rights record? How do you balance providing security assistance and promoting human rights, and what other arms sales to the Central Asian states are underway or being contemplated?
Congressman, I'll attempt to answer that. So when we get requests for transfers of military equipment, in this case it was the Excess Defense Articles program, the EDA program, there's a actually very long process of reviewing the requests and looking at who the recipients will actually be within the country, looking at the security needs that it's trying to address, the ability of whoever it's going to sustain the equipment, and other factors, including human rights and the dynamics of the region in terms of the sort of the security balance within the region. We delivered these mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles, the so-called MRAPs, to Uzbekistan after this careful review. And it was done because we determined that they would help to improve Uzbekistan's border security and its ability to carry out counterterrorism and counter-narcotics operations, and because these were deemed to be purely defensive vehicles, purely defensive equipment. They will be used only by Ministry of Defense personnel. Internal security or police forces are not authorized to use the equipment. And the equipment is subject to end-use restrictions and regular monitoring by U.S. personnel on the ground. The other piece of this gets to vetting of the actual units that will be using the equipment, and that has to go through a process to ensure compliance with human rights concerns as well. The security cooperation with Uzbekistan that we have is always infused with this element of the connection between protection of human rights and security partnership. And the points that Das Brzezinski mentioned in his opening about the interrelationship is something that I would emphasize, and that is that whenever we do training, whenever we have a dialogue about security cooperation, there's always an element in there about how important the protection of human rights is, or there are courses that are actually oriented towards that goal that are part of the security training.
Are there other arms sales or that are underway or being contemplated for
the only other
Central
one,
Asian states?
The only other current, and this is actually also unfolded over a long period of time, transfer of equipment is for utility helicopters, UEs, UH-1s, to Kazakhstan under the Excess Defense Articles program. 2 of them have already been delivered, and there are 2 more that are in process. We do have a standing offer to consider requests under the Excess Defense Articles program, and that we've made to all the Central Asian countries. So far, the Kazakhstan helicopters and these MRAPs in Uzbekistan are the only 2 that have gone forward.
Yeah, and you're confident with the oversight that's in place? I mean, the reason why I ask, is, a lot of people ask, well, what can we do to ensure that U.S. foreign assistance dollars aren't being used to actually support things that we're very much against, or are not used to train individuals, for example, who end up committing human rights abuses on behalf of either a government or an extremist group. And I raise that because there's been some media reports in recent weeks that a high-ranking officer from Tajikistan's elite national police force who defected to join Islamic State reportedly received military training from the United States over the course of several years. And so, it just begs the question, are we confident that these checks and balances that we have in place, prevent things like this from happening, or having armaments or military equipment ending up in the wrong hands?
I would say, Congressman, that we are confident that we are doing everything we can, everything within our power to monitor and to vet participants in security training and to see what happens to equipment after it's transferred to countries. The case that you cited is a good example of how you can't always control every factor in these situations. So in that case, you had a high-ranking, the leader actually of the Interior Ministry's elite security forces in Tajikistan, defecting to ISIL. And that individual had participated in a number of training programs over the years, starting when he was a lower-ranking person, as he worked his way up through the ranks, and had each time been vetted for the kinds of things we look at, which is any connection to gross violations of human rights by him or the unit that he was assigned to. And he had passed all those standard vetting procedures. And I should also point out that he and all the other participants in training courses are selected and recommended by the governments first. But he had passed all that vetting, and very frankly, I don't think the government of Tajikistan anticipated either that this outcome would happen. It was I would say a surprise as much to the government of Tajikistan as to us.
Just one final question. I mean, is there any indication that Central Asian states are generally responsive to international pressure to improve the protection of basic political freedoms and human rights? I mean, and the reason why I ask that is because, some of us here in Congress who were involved in the passing of the Magnitsky Act, which was originally global in intent, that then got narrowed down to Russia-specific, but we're talking about expanding the scope of the Magnitsky Act. Could that be a potential tool, an effective tool to encourage Central Asian states to improve the protection of basic civil and political freedoms? I mean, we would be the sanction would be targeted more against individuals that we know are not good, denying them that there'd be a consequence for either being guilty of corruption or gross human rights violations.
I think, and Mr. Congressman, this also speaks to the example of the Tajikistani official. The message that we are bringing to these governments that we hope to have some amount of traction, given what they are concerned about in terms of transnational threats. The message that we are delivering at the highest levels, and that I'll have the opportunity to deliver in Kazakhstan next week, is that their repression, whether it be repression of a religious expression or other forms of expression or freedom of assembly, access to media, all of these attempts to crack down on civil society have the inverse effect to what they truly desire in terms of their own security and the potential radicalization of their populations, both within their borders and those that would go off to places like Syria and Iraq and fight for ISIL. it remains to be seen to what extent those governments will accept that argument, but at the same time, it's a very real one. The empirical data is firm on this in terms of what motivates radicalization, and so I think it's a very powerful message.
Thank you. Mr. Pitts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Rosenblum, let me ask you about the EEU, the Eurasian Economic Union. As you know, the EU is an economic union between Kazakhstan, Russia, and Belarus that was created in 2014, with Armenia and Kyrgyzstan joining later in 2015. And the EU provides an integrated market which facilitates trade and free movement, and it currently includes 3 supranational structures: an executive commission, a court, and a development bank. Now, Russia has been pushing for more integration with a possible parliament and shared currency in the future. My question to you is, what impact is the Eurasian Economic Union likely to have on human rights in the region, and what kind of impact is the EU likely to have, if any, on regional human rights issues?
Congressman, that's an excellent question. The EU is something that many people are focused on now, as it's a fairly new player, and there's a lot of speculation about what it means. I would say at this point, we haven't seen any move to harmonize laws or regulations that fall outside the economic sphere, including those that relate to human rights. Of course, if this was to happen, we would have concerns, and we'd raise those concerns with member governments. So far, it appears to be a purely economic organization, and I would add that some of the member states, including in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and the newest member, Kyrgyzstan, have really insisted in publicly on this, that it remain an economic and a trading organization and not be a political organization. Again, we'll continue to monitor it closely, because that would have implications if that scenario, but so far we don't see any move in that direction.
Let me follow up with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's an economic and political and military organization that was originally founded in 1996, originally called the Shanghai Five, until Uzbekistan joined in 2001. And that organization is focused on regional military cooperation and economic cooperation through loans and easing trade barriers. With regards to regional security, the organization is currently focused on combating terrorism, separatism, and extremism. And Turkmenistan is not a member. Do the security-related activities of the SCO contribute or detract from human rights practices within Central Asia?
Congressman, as you know, the U.S. is not a member of the SCO, although, of course, we do follow its meetings and talk to its member states frequently. They do have several security programs and groupings within SCO that address security issues. There's a regional anti-terrorism center in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, under the SCO umbrella. And I think what we've seen is that different governments participate in these programs to different degrees when they believe there's some benefit to them. It's in principle, the organization can be a valuable forum for dialogue among neighbors. But I would point out that the sort of principles and values of the organization are different from that of other regional organizations like the OSCE. And we actually believe that the OSCE is a much stronger forum on issues of human rights. Obviously, the basic principle of OSCE with its 3 baskets, and the idea that those 3 baskets are all inseparable elements of security, that security is not just hardware and hard security, it's also about the economic element, and it's about the human dimension. That's something that we believe is the right approach, and that's why, of course, we work through that organization. But I'll ask if
Secretary
Rob
Brzezinski
wants to add.
Sure, just a little bit to add to that. Our engagement continues to highlight the benefit of respect for human rights across all elements of society in these countries, and that obviously includes the security sector, as I mentioned previously. So to kind of build off of the point about how we believe that engagement through the OSCE is probably a better way to go, our firm belief is that when combating transnational threats, infusing respect for human rights should be at the core of everything that these countries do. Thank you.
Secretary Brzezinski, let me continue with you on the issue of religious freedom. The basic question is, how can the United States use the CPC, the country of particular concern mechanism, more effectively to improve religious freedom in Central Asia? I would note that the State Department has designated Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan as CPCs for their particularly severe religious freedom violations, but indefinitely waived punitive action against them. What has the effect of the CPC designation been? And what's your opinion on lifting the waivers?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. As you mentioned, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and I should add Saudi Arabia have all been designated as CPC countries, and under his legal authority, the Secretary of State has issued a national interest waiver on the sanctions that come under the International Religious Freedom Act. These countries most certainly engage in a number of human rights abuses with respect to freedom of religion, detention and imprisonment of religious minorities, issues dealing with religious groups having to register with the governments, and a significant amount of harassment. We continue to engage often and at the highest levels with these governments, urging them to improve their religious freedom in their countries. And to your question, I would say that listing as a CPC does in itself have an effect. There is a reputational hit in terms of the listing, and we've seen that though we are nowhere near where we need to be, we have made some amount of progress through the listing themselves and the sustained engagement. As I mentioned in my opening statement, for instance, with the Turkmenistanis in releasing some small amount of political prisoners held for their religious beliefs. Of course, we need to continue working with these governments through bilateral and multilateral means. In the meeting I held with the Tajikistani foreign minister just a couple of weeks ago, I raised this and had a fairly lengthy conversation with both him and the chairman of their religious commission. And with respect to Tajikistan, this is a country that knows that we are watching and that the secretary has it within his authority to designate at any time. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's continue a little bit on the Tajik situation. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom since 2012 recommended that Tajikistan be designated as a CPC. Can you speak as to why they haven't been listed on the CPC list, or why not?
So, yes, sir. As I mentioned, there are a number of ongoing deficiencies in Tajikistan with respect to religious freedom. We take USCIRF's recommendations seriously. That said, the Secretary made his determination on the basis of recommendations from the Department of State. As I mentioned, we communicate very clearly and plainly the problems that continue to exist within Tajikistan, and as I mentioned, also communicate clearly to the government that the Secretary has the authority to designate and will make that decision in due course on the basis of the information that we provide.
Well, let's go then to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. According to international observers, religious freedom conditions in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are also deteriorating. What other actions can the U.S. take to encourage religious freedom in these countries?
If I, Congressman, if you'll allow me, if I could just say another word on
Yeah,
Uzbekistan
sure.
on the previous question, then
Go
we'll
ahead.
go to your last question. In terms of the CPC designation, it's clear to me that the possibility of that designation is definitely a motivating factor, at least in terms of engaging in dialogue about our concerns and talking about ways we can address them. In February of this year, I went to Tajikistan together with Deputy Assistant Secretary Brzezinski's predecessor in his job to engage in a dialogue about the concerns we had, which are about registration of religious groups. They're about some of the laws that restrict the rights of women and children to worship publicly, and other issues as well. And it was a very open and candid dialogue. We definitely have different perspectives on the appropriateness of some of those restrictions, but we talked about very practical ways that laws could perhaps be amended or modifications could be made so that to eliminate or at least reduce some of those restrictive policies. Your question about Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, we do raise issues of religious freedom and concerns about legislation on a regular basis with both countries when those issues come up. And I think, just to reemphasize a point that I think both of us have made a couple of times now, we definitely draw the connection between the policies that relate to freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, and freedom to worship, and the bad effects of forcing people to worship underground or be perhaps more vulnerable to recruitment by extremist groups with extremist ideologies. So that it remains an important element of our dialogue with both.
Some of these governments seem to be stuck in that old Soviet model of registering, depending on the size. And these religious groups, are they threatened mostly by the extremist Muslim elements? What is the motivation, or is this just the old Soviet model influence?
Do you want me to take a crack at it? I do think that there's a different tradition in terms of how you regulate religion, certainly very vastly different from ours in the region, and which sometimes makes it hard to have when we have the dialogue to find a common understanding. I'm not sure I'm competent to analyze whether it's because of primarily the Soviet influence or some other reason. But a lot of what goes on, I think, is motivated by one of two things. One is concern about the possibility of radicalization or radical groups that might operate within the country and wanting to monitor and be aware of those. And that mostly concerns, I would say, the majority of the population, which are Muslim in the countries. But I think there's also not the same established respect for diversity of religion, which is so embedded in our culture and extends to even very small groups being accepted as valid expressions of religious faith. And that's just it's not part of, I would say it's not part of the kind of cultural legacy in general. That said, the picture's not the same everywhere in the region, as I said in my opening statement, and I think there's some, reason for optimism. And I would just point to last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a very large conference held in Kazakhstan, sponsored by the government of Kazakhstan, a gathering of leaders of world religion. Our special envoy for religious affairs, Mr. Sean Casey, represented the United States there, and was very impressed with this dialogue and discussion that was promoted by the government of Kazakhstan. So, so again, there's, I would say it's not a uniformly bleak picture.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to our witnesses. I'd like to first turn to the issue of LGBT security and the security of LGBT persons in the region, and get your assessment of how much of that, if any, is being driven by the Russian influence in the region, these anti-propaganda laws, and what we're doing, what the United States is doing to push back on that direction. And thirdly, what are we doing to ensure the safety and security of embassy personnel who are members of the LGBT community working in this region in Central Asia, in this part of the world?
I think the answer to the first portion of your question, I'll take a tack somewhat similar to what Des Rosenblum just mentioned, which is the answer is probably a combination of both cultural factors and some amount of influence or a reflection of the approach undertaken by Russia recently. The extent to which one is greater than the other, I wouldn't want to guess at. But that said, I think both are probably factors. We are watching the restriction of rights with respect to LGBT persons very closely, expressing concern both publicly and privately. Our position has not changed, which is that no one should be harassed or threatened with violence or have violence committed upon them or imprisoned because of who they are or who they love. And that's a message that we have made to the governments of the region repeatedly.
And what about the third part of that? What are we doing to assure the security of embassy officials and personnel who are members of this community working in places that are very intolerant to members of the LGBT, to say the least?
Congressman, I guess I would say as a general matter that the safety and security of our personnel is job one for all of our ambassadors and all of us back in Washington supporting them as well. This, I think the key thing for our personnel is awareness of what they might face in the country, and taking the necessary the necessary precautions, and also our ambassadors, our representatives, stressing in every dealing that they have, both diplomatically but also through our programs, our assistance programs, the importance of respect for the rights of all citizens and all diplomats, regardless of gender, of race, of sexual orientation. It's in the sort of the core of our message at all times, including with officials who are not necessarily the foreign ministry, but in other ministries as well, who deal with the police and other things. So it's again at the core of our dealings.
Could I just add one thing,
course.
Congressman? While stipulating that, of course, our top priority is the safety and security of U.S. personnel, I would also add that being relatively new to DRL, one of the aspects of our actions that I've been very impressed with is that we have emergency funds as well that we use on occasion to protect human rights defenders and those that might be threatened in various ways, to provide medical care or transportation sometimes, and that this too, this is an incredible tool, and it's one that we've brought to bear in terms of protecting LGBT people within the region.
Thank you. To follow up on another area that the chairman referenced, with respect to our foreign assistance to all these countries in Central Asia, do we condition that assistance on meeting any benchmarks or making progress on any of these human rights, religious expression, freedom of the press issues? And in instances, if we don't do that, in instances where they receive waivers, are those waivers conditioned on some agreement to meet any kind of benchmark? Because the sort of final question is, if we don't, and we grant these waivers liberally, and we deeply engage in conversation, but there's no consequence or even an expectation of change behavior, is it actually an effective way to approach this whole set of issues?
Congressman, that's a really good question, interesting one, and one that it coincides very closely with my previous job before here, where I was in charge of the foreign assistance coordination for Central Asia and the former Soviet region in general, and this question came up often. The first thing I would say is that the structure of our assistance is, in general, and almost entirely not oriented towards giving large sums of money, budget support, or things, equipment, to the countries of the region. It's much more oriented, almost exclusively, to technical assistance, exchanges, training, and kind of exposure to ideas and knowledge. And so, in that respect, we're able to target that kind of assistance to the people who we think will benefit from it, or who are more, I guess you could say, reform-oriented, or share our view of how their society should develop. To the extent that we do provide assistance to any country, the degree of it is connected to the situation, the overall situation of governance. So, and I'll give you, an example here, that the two biggest recipients right now of assistance in Central Asia from our foreign assistance funding are Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, with a lot of that assistance being oriented towards basic development needs and poverty alleviation, economic development, and so on. We used to have a very large assistance program right after 9/11 in the early 2000s in Uzbekistan, and after the Andijan events, which were referred to earlier, that assistance diminished considerably. We still engage in Uzbekistan, and we, as I was saying earlier, these sort of opportunistic working with partners where we think progress can be made, but it's much less than it could be. And then finally, I will say, this goes back to the point that I made in my opening statement, which is that in order to realize the full potential of our relationship, I think I said some words to that effect, including through foreign assistance, there has to be some change.
And with the chairman's indulgence, I'll just follow up that with one question. So could you speak a little to sort of the current status of civil society, and particularly NGOs, and our ability to effectively assist them to advance this work? The kind of description of the conditions in which the representatives from NGOs and civil society find themselves is pretty dismal in this region. Are there things we can be doing differently, better, to make their work more impactful? And is my assessment, which is pretty dim, accurate?
I'll start. This goes back to something that we've said previously today about the differentiation between the countries, that it isn't all one, undifferentiated region. I would say that the state of civil society and NGOs in Kyrgyzstan in particular is pretty vibrant and active. I think that's an accurate statement to be made about Kazakhstan as well. And NGOs play a role in both engaging with the government and doing advocacy and policy recommendations and so on, but also in terms of protecting parts of the population, protecting the rights of minority groups within the population, providing health services or social protection and other things. So there is a lively, active civil society movement in several of the countries of the region. It's more difficult for them to operate in other places. There are severe restrictions put on their ability to advocate, their ability to fund themselves. And this goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier about legislation and seeking legislative changes to open more space for civil society groups. We are able to, I'd say everywhere in the region, to at least have some kind of engagement with civil society, but our ability to provide training or exchange opportunities or grants and so on isn't the same everywhere.
If I could just add a couple of things to that. I would just make 3 points, one of which Dan largely covered, but just in terms of our approach to supporting civil society, the first, again, is pushing back on these restrictive NGO laws and how seriously we take that. The second is not only in terms of our engagement with regional NGOs, both when we visit from Washington and on a much more frequent basis, those posted overseas. Not only is it a good in its own right, and we learn from that experience and share information and hopefully build these groups' capabilities somewhat, but also we've heard that it serves, not always, but largely a protective function for those groups. That's the feedback we receive from them, that their engagement with personnel from our embassies overseas often is good for them from a perspective of protection. And then third, and this is something that I'm looking forward to doing personally next week, is bringing those voices into the policy-making process and ensuring that they're not cut out of the policy-making process. So when we have next week this regional summit on countering violent extremism, not only has the United States fought for and insisted upon robust civil society participation, but also I'll be going out there a day early to meet with regional groups and ensure that their voices infuse the interventions I bring into that conversation and ensure that that becomes part of the policymaking process.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much for your time with us here today. I appreciate it. Appreciate all the work that you do, and we appreciate your answers. And we may have some follow-up questions that we'll submit to you in writing. But again, we very much appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm now pleased to call the next panel, Ms. Allison Gill, Central Asia expert at Amnesty International, Dr. Sanjar Umarov, a former political prisoner in Uzbekistan and founder of Sunshine Uzbekistan, a political coalition established to promote human rights, rule of law, and social and economic reforms in Uzbekistan. Mr. Jeffrey Goldstein, Senior Policy Analyst for Eurasia at Open Society Foundations. I want to thank you all for your presence today, especially Dr. Umarov for his willingness to share his personal experience, as well as his insights from leading an opposition movement in Uzbekistan. I look forward to hearing all of your testimonies and recommendations for U.S. policy. I would like to formally submit the written testimonies of all the witnesses into the hearing record, and I would also like to formally submit the written testimony from Human Rights Campaign to the record. And while you come up, I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge one of our staffers here, Sue Choi, this is her last, tomorrow is her last day with the Lantos Human Rights Commission, and we want to publicly appreciate all the great work that she's done, and we wish her well. I don't know how you could go on with your life without being here, but you'll manage. But I want to call the witnesses to the table and look forward to hearing your testimony. And we'll begin with Ms. Gill. Ms. Gill, why don't you begin? Welcome.
Good afternoon. On behalf of Amnesty International, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I want to thank the Commission for its attention to Central Asia. In the context of deepening authoritarian trends in Central Asia and entrenched human rights violations, including endemic torture, talking about shrinking space for civic freedoms may sound purely academic or not much cause for concern given how small the space was in the first place. But there are worrying signs that the governments in all 5 countries in Central Asia are becoming ever more intolerant of independent scrutiny and monitoring of their human rights records, by often shutting their borders to critical voices and by squeezing the life out of domestic civil society through regulation and restriction, as well as through more brutal methods such as harassment, torture and other ill treatment, and arbitrary imprisonment. They also sometimes are using national security rhetoric to justify repression of civil society. This has enormous implications for human rights as well as the rule of law and stability. And we heard on the first panel that it's not a monolithic region, that there's differentiation among the 5 countries, and that's very true. But the trend across the region is of shrinking space for civic freedoms. And I'm just going to touch upon a couple of recent developments in each of the 5 countries. The government of Kazakhstan continues its crackdown on freedom of expression, including by closing independent media outlets critical of the authorities. Any street protest, even by an individual, requires express government permission. Unsanctioned street rallies, no matter how small and peaceful, have been repeatedly disrupted by the police, often with the use of excessive force. In Tajikistan, where the government has persecuted people and groups working on issues such as freedom of expression, religious freedom, and political participation, in the last couple of weeks, the tax authorities have conducted intrusive audits of 22 human rights organizations on a request from the State Committee on National Security on the basis of possible security threats they may pose. In Kyrgyzstan, where there is still a vibrant civil society, some groups have come under enormous pressure. And as we heard, the parliament is considering 2 pieces of restrictive legislation closely modeled on laws in Russia. A homophobic propaganda law that would restrict freedom of speech by imposing criminal penalties for promoting non-traditional sexual relations that would make work on LGBT rights impossible, and a foreign agents law that would force groups that receive foreign funding and undertake vaguely defined political activities to register with the government as foreign agents. And in just one recent example of the crackdown on civil society in Uzbekistan, on May 29th, police officers and medical personnel viciously assaulted activist Yelena Orlaeva as she was documenting forced labor in the cotton fields. Police detained her for many hours, hit her on the head, forcibly injected her with sedatives, and subjected her to a body cavity search and forced x-rays, ostensibly to look for the memory card to the camera she used to photograph people forced to work in the fields. In Turkmenistan, the government uses imprisonment to retaliate against dissent and refuses to provide information about the fate and whereabouts of people imprisoned many years ago for political reasons, which may amount to enforced disappearance. It has also recently waged a campaign to remove or destroy private satellite dishes, which provide the only independent sources of information for many in the population. Across the region, we also find that torture remains a serious and pervasive problem. And although some steps toward accountability have been taken over the last 2 decades, they have not resulted in eliminating torture and other ill treatment. Endemic corruption in law enforcement bodies and the judiciary contributes to a climate of impunity in the region, leading in turn to a lack of public confidence in the justice system. Many are unwilling to testify against members of the security forces for fear of reprisals. The governments of Central Asia are increasingly invoking national security, the fight against terrorism, and combating anti-state activity to justify repressive measures against actual or suspected members of outlawed Islamist groups and parties. Those detained on charges related to national security or religious extremism are at particular risk of torture and other ill treatment. In researching our April 2015 report on torture in Uzbekistan, we spoke with a woman in her 60s that we call Zuhra, not her real name. And she told us that police detained her, took her to a basement detention facility, and held her without charge for several weeks. She was beaten on her body, kicked in her head and her face, subjected to sexual humiliation. She saw women dragged by their hair, forcibly stripped naked and beaten, their bones broken. She was brought to court only to prolong her detention. She was tortured to extract evidence about her relatives, many of whom are in prison or are being investigated on charges related to religious extremism. Uzbekistan uses cooperation in the so-called war on terrorism to justify persecution of those who practice their faith outside state-approved mosques and those who are suspected members of banned Islamist groups. And it also persecutes their families and even entire communities. Zuhra told us that there are no men left in her family. They are all in prison or have fled, fearing persecution. As Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, said on his recent visit to Central Asia, curbing freedoms may create an illusion of stability in the short run, but in his words, failure to respect rights creates space for extremism. And by attempting to shut down efforts to shine light on the real issues plaguing Central Asia, by shrinking the civic space even further, tightening restrictions on freedom of expression and association, Central Asian governments can project an image of security while escaping effective accountability for human rights violations. It's urgent to push back against this increasing clampdown, to take steps to protect those documenting abuses, and to increase scrutiny and accountability, to end impunity in the short term and to ensure real stability in the long run. We want to challenge the notion that strategic patience will produce substantive human rights improvements in Central Asia. Instead, we urge the United States to engage more meaningfully and robustly with Central Asian governments on human rights. One of the most important things the U.S. government can do is to help push all the Central Asian governments to open their human rights records to effective independent scrutiny. This means all 5 countries would allow domestic and international human rights groups to work without harassment and interference. And the governments of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan would grant permission for access to their countries for visits by all the special mandate holders of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. We also specifically urge the U.S. government to take a leadership role, together with like-minded states, in moving forward on the creation of a special mechanism at the United Nations to report specifically on Uzbekistan's human rights records. We've made some other recommendations that I've submitted in the written testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Umarov to begin, and we're honored that you're here. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, member of the Commission, thank you for inviting me to testify at this hearing. Your Commission is named after a special man, the late Representative Tom Lantos. The only Holocaust survivor who became a member of Congress, he was renowned throughout the world for his fierce dedication to human rights and is fondly remembered to this day. Speaking at this event is a great honor for me. I have a written presentation I would like to submit for the record with your permission. At this point, I like to present a shorter version. The focus of today's hearing is U.S. policy in Central Asia as Washington draws down its force from Afghanistan. But U.S. policy has always featured an interlocking combination of goals even before September 11, 2001, and the campaign in Afghanistan. The United States has had 4 basic aims: to support the independence and sovereignty of the countries in the region, to cooperate with them in security matters, to marketize Central Asia's vast energy resources and diversify their delivery routes to the outside world, and to promote democratization and human rights. Those goals remain in place today. Deputy Secretary Blinken's policy statement a few months ago basically reiterated the same priorities despite a changed international environment. It's clear that more progress has been made realizing the first 3 than the last. The State Department's annual reports document the widespread, even systemic violation of human rights by authoritarian, corrupt regimes in Central Asia that have blocked the emergence of institutions that could jeopardize their positions, failed to develop checks and balances, permit democratization, safeguard human rights, or establish reliable rules for the transfer of power. This applied to 5 regional states to varying degrees, but I maintain it is accurate overall. What's even more depressing is that these assessments and similar reports by international NGOs have changed little over the years. I suspect the country reports of 1995 or 2005, when I was arrested, will differ only in the details and names of the incarcerated and repressed. Of course, the United States hopes to spread democracy around the world, but Washington has a limited number of instruments to press other capitals to make reform they oppose out of perceived self-interest. The experience of the last 25 years shows what such efforts have not succeeded in effecting systemic change in the face of strong resistance by local elites. Nor should we be deluded about the policy ramifications of the military drawdown from Afghanistan. Will the United States really shift its priorities in Central Asia from security to democracy promotion just because U.S. troops are leaving Afghanistan? The Taliban remains a serious threat, and with the Islamic State already drawing several thousand recruits from Central Asia, security will surely remain a top priority. So will the emphasis on independence. Given President Putin's assault on Ukraine and a much more threatening Russian approach to neighboring countries, the American commitment to supporting the sovereignty of Central Asian states will be important as before. Regional capitals will seek that assurance, and Washington will strive to provide it. As regards energy and developing other economic sectors, they will obviously continue to play a critical role in U.S. policy. The New Silk Road Initiative is the latest iteration of a constant focus of attention over a decade, along with renewed stress on connectivity and regional integration. Finally, the promotion of democracy is a bedrock of U.S. policy throughout the world, even in unfriendly or unappreciative regions. These too will continue no matter whether U.S. troops are based in Afghanistan or not, even then the prospects for success are not encouraging. Given these realities, I think we must recognize that a new day of democratic development is not necessarily about to dawn in Central Asia. The region's leaders and elite will hardly grow less corrupt or more indulgent of criticism, dissent, opposition political activity, or independent judiciary. Most recently, President Karimov of Uzbekistan again orchestrated his re-election despite constitutional term limits, and the same can be expected elsewhere in the region. So, bearing extraordinary development, we are likely to see more of the same with regard to regional effects on the ground and U.S. policy. This is an especially difficult acknowledgement for me as a former political prisoner in Uzbekistan. Nobody more than I would welcome change for the better, and nobody here understands better the consequence of the more of the same. I was a successful businessman in Uzbekistan who got into politics because of deplorable condition in cotton sector. In 2005, I was moved to create the Sunshine Coalition in response to blatant corruption. My attempt to build a large plant for the production of liquid hydrocarbons from natural gas using American technology was blocked when we were told we could only act through a company controlled by President's daughter. When I refused, I was arrested in October 2005. During my pretrial detention, which lasted 4 months, I was interrogated continuously and often beaten. After a farcical trial, I was sentenced to 14.5 years. I was sent to a prison colony and placed in solitary confinement for 14 months. But my lowest point came in January 2008 when I was thrown in the monkey cage, a cell open to the elements. The first time I nearly froze to death. The second time they threw me in there because I refused to confess that the United States gave me $20 million to overthrow Uzbekistan's government. They broke my thumb and choked me, permanently damaging my vocal cords. But I refused to sign. I lost all hope what I'd ever get out. But one day, while I was in the prison hospital, I was summoned to the administration building. To my astonishment, within minutes I was released. Just when all seemed lost, I was free and reunited with my family. My story, Mr. Chairman, a political arrest, trumped-up conviction, and torture in jail all reflect more of the same. Refusing to pay a bribe and trying to reform politics in a country whose leadership refused to tolerate sincere attempt at reform made me a prisoner of conscience. So what can the US government do? First, we should recognize that outside of Kyrgyzstan, today's Central Asia leaders will not voluntarily step down, allow fair election, or permit the emergence of the robust civil society, no matter how often or urgently they are exhorted to do so. I see no persuasive evidence that they can be induced or pressured into making systemic reforms. Still, the United States should continue to criticize human rights violations and try to move this country in a progressive direction. Second, reform will be a long-term process. Apart from youth exchanges, which should be supported and expanded, I believe we should more actively engage Central Asian parliaments. Of course, they do not play the same role as the US Congress, but the potential unpredictable benefits are worth the effort. In Uzbekistan, the Oli Majlis has a critical, albeit formal role in the transfer of power and government makeup. However unplausible today, I could imagine the Oli Majlis beginning to exercise its natural constitutional role. A generational change in leadership is inevitable. Opportunity for greater engagement with individuals who now in parliament, who may in future play key governmental, security, and prosecutorial role should not be missed. In general, Mr. Chairman, I do not believe isolation of even the most repressive Central Asian country is a fruitful course. And with Russia now openly threatening its neighbors, I hope the United States will continue to support their sovereignty and territorial integrity. However critical I might be of my homeland, I share with all Uzbeks a deep commitment to its independence. I also believe that relations should be developed between Central Asia countries and regions in the United States. In my own city of Memphis, Tennessee, a center is being established that will focus on developing ties with Central Asia. With all respect to Washington, regional centers have an important role to play in fostering economic, cultural, and educational relations that will help promote democratization. For the near term, I think the most important thing Washington can do is seek the release of political prisoners. This is how I was freed, not because Uzbek authority regretted my treatment, but because my family organized a campaign of pressure with the help of members of Congress, diplomats, and international organizations. I would like here to note that Congressman Lantos was one of the signers of the resolution on my behalf, which played such an important role in getting me released. I was lucky. Unfortunately, There are many such prisoners in Uzbekistan. Last year, Human Rights Watch issued a report on political prisoners in my homeland. I would like to mention 3 who deserve American intercession. Muhammad Bekjanov, who is the longest imprisoned journalist in the world. Rustam Usmanov, head of the first private bank, Rustam Bank in Uzbekistan. And Yelena Urlaeva, an incredibly brave human rights activist who has been harassed for years and jailed many times, occasionally in psychiatric institutions. In closing, Mr. Chairman, my policy suggestion may seem limited, but if I thought more broad-ranging measures would be effective at this point, I would recommend them. I hope to be able one day to take a more active role in bringing reform to Uzbekistan. But for now, I do what I can to help my native land, even as I reside in freedom and security with my family in Tennessee. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And finally, Mr. Goldstein, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. As you noted in your opening remarks, since 2007, American policy in Central Asia was largely an adjunct of American policy in Afghanistan. Policy initiatives in Central Asia were largely judged on a single factor. Would they promote or would they put at risk the Northern Distribution Network? And this unfortunately led to an American policy in Central Asia that was highly risk-averse. It also led to almost a complete failure of American public diplomacy in the region when it came to issues of democracy and governance. The administration's approach of handling delicate human rights issues behind closed doors produced almost no positive results, and in fact, human rights standards declined pretty much throughout the region. I wanted to address one issue that Deputy Assistant Secretary Rosenblum raised, which was the comment that one success of American policy has been the decline in the use of child labor in cotton in Uzbekistan. And I think it's interesting to drill down into that. I think it's no accident that only a matter of weeks after the State Department announced that it was downgrading Uzbekistan to the lowest level, Tier 3, for trafficking in persons, that the Uzbeks reversed course, and after many years of refusing to do so, decided to engage with the ILO on child labor issues. What's missing from this, though, is the fact that for many years, the State Department, for fear of angering President Karimov and putting at risk the Northern Distribution Network, had maintained Uzbekistan on the Tier 2 watch list status. And it was actually only you here in Congress who forced the State Department's hand by passing a new reauthorization of the TVPA that limited the amount of time that the State Department could maintain a country on Tier 2 watch list status. So in fact, it was outside pressure, including from Congress and the NGO community, that forced the administration's hand to take what ultimately was a successful initiative. The initiative, unfortunately, did not originate in the administration. Seeing Central Asia through the Afghanistan lens also led to what we believe was a significant mismatch between the U.S. government's own threat perception and its foreign policy and foreign assistance policy. Co-Chairman Pitts mentioned General Clapper's statement in 2015 that the Central Asian states most likely will face crisis, potentially with little warning, because of unclear succession plans, weak economies, ethnic tensions, and political repressions. And yet, throughout the last several years, U.S. policy has given pride of place to hard security issues and devoted far greater resources to things like border control assistance, anti-drug assistance, as opposed to assistance to promote democracy and human rights. And unfortunately, I have to say that this approach continues to this day. Dr. Umarov mentioned Deputy Secretary Blinken's March 31st policy statement, and there again, in listing U.S. priorities in the region, Mr. Blinken followed the old script. First off was hard security, combating terrorism and violent extremism. Secondly, a not too hidden swipe at Russia, supporting sovereignty and independence in these countries. Only then, as has unfortunately always been the case in these last many years, did he get around to mentioning governance and democracy as priorities. Now, I don't want to make the impression that radical forces and outside threats from Russia are not a threat. I think they are. This clearly shows up in the number of Central Asians who are now appearing in Syria and Iraq to fight with ISIL. It shows up in the legislation that others have talked about appearing there that's copied, in fact, in many cases about the only thing changes is replace Russian Federation with name of your country in this repressive law. I would, however, like to disagree slightly with Deputy Assistant Secretary Bershinsky when he talked about the anti-LGBT legislation we are seeing in the region. As you'll recall, he said this is a combination of factors, that these are conservative societies and there is also some influence from Russia. But the point I would make is these societies today are no more conservative than they were 20 years ago. And this was not a political issue until people with a political agenda, people coming from Russia, took advantage of the conservative nature of these societies to make this an issue as part of their cultural war, which I think it's very important for this distinguished body to recall, is very much designed to paint the U.S. and the West as the decadent enemy, anti-Russian, trying to create regime change throughout this region. I think that what the United States government needs to do is to recraft a policy to better address the threat analysis that General Clapper stated, and which we firmly agree. The United States needs to do much more to deal with the fact that it's these regional governments' own repressive policies and their failure to deal with key human security challenges that are sowing threats to stability in the region and therefore threats to the U.S.'s own national interest. Now, such an approach, as we heard from Dr. Omarov, is not going to be welcomed on the part of the governments of Central Asia. But I think the United States has generally and unfortunately taken a policy approach of we need these people more than they need us, therefore we have to be very careful. I think this policy understates the leverage the United States has. We've heard before this is a rough neighborhood. Not all of the neighbors are people that they get along with. Even Uzbekistan has, in fact, withdrawn from the CSTO, the military security organization created by the Russians. And this desire to keep the U.S. government engaged provides leverage. Many of these countries want the laying on of hands provided by high-level visits back and forth. Others, the poorer ones, need American assistance. All of them want American security assistance, and this provides leverage. And we think that this leverage should be used as the focus of a long-term, value-driven engagement that would put human security, rather than more traditional security, at the core of U.S. policy. So we would recommend that while the United States continue to engage with regional governments on issues of mutual interest, the U.S. also needs to push back harder in areas of human rights, governments, and democracies. And the United States needs to do this more publicly. Unfortunately, and I used to work at the State Department, it's very easy when you're in a State Department embassy to think of your counterpart as the government of a country. But there's another audience out there that is listening to what you say or hearing the silence when you don't say anything. It's very important that United States officials make clear to the governments in these regions that we want to work with you on issues where we have mutual interests, but where we think you're taking actions that are contrary to American national interests, we're going to say so, and we're going to say so publicly. The United States needs to reconfigure its approach to security in Central Asia, focusing increasingly scarce assistance resources away from the security sector and onto broader human security issues, including support for democratization, good governance, civil society and independent media, education, healthcare, and employment. A friend of mine is now the head of the UN Drug Agency in Kyrgyzstan, and she told an interesting story, which was that in 2010, under the previous government, the Kyrgyz approached the OSCE to request $7 million to create a vetted Anti-Narcotics Unit. It was stood up, but the first time they went after a narco-trafficker who had very high-level protection in the government disbanded the unit. A few months later, the Kiev government fell, and the new government went to the UN and said, can we have $5 million to create a new vetted counter-narcotics unit? And sad to say, one of the major uses of the American taxpayers' assistance dollars in Central Asia over the last several years have been efforts to create more vetted counter-narcotics units in countries where I don't think that there is a commitment on highest levels of governments to really fight trafficking, and in fact, in at least one of the countries where the government may be trafficker-in-chief. Similarly, we think that the United States should comprehensively review security and law enforcement policy. You simply cannot produce effective reform in countries where there's no political will to create reform, and there are dangers involved in this. If you look at the videos shot when the Kiev government fell, the snipers firing in the crowd from the roofs of the government house in Bishkek were wearing what very much looked like US-supplied uniforms. And so there is a very significant reputational risk that goes into things like providing MRAPs to Uzbekistan or helicopters to Kazakhstan. And finally, we believe the U.S. should lead an intensive effort by international financial institutions and other key donors to refocus and coordinate assistance programs to address the alarming decline in Central Asian human capital and the socioeconomic threats posed by the current prospect of a deep and long-lasting recession in Russia that is, at least in some part, the product of U.S. policy choices in imposing sanctions on Russia. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and we're joined by my colleague, Congressman Doug Collins from Georgia, and I'm going to yield to him for any comments or questions he may have. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Governor. I appreciate you, and I thank you. One of the reasons that I was asked before being appointed to this Human Rights Commission was the very stories, Mr. Chairman, that you told. It's the very thing from my background as a pastor, also in the military, but also as a chaplain, but also from a lawyer background is the very issues that you bring to our consciousness here in Congress, here in Washington, and the stories that you tell highlight many of the things that we sometimes only speak of in the abstract. And for that, I want to thank you for your courage. Thank you for your willingness to come, but also just for being here. I think your indomitable spirit inside and your smile after all that you described is pretty amazing. And that.
Thank you. Smile helped me a lot.
I think that's maybe that might be the takeaway for the whole hearing. A smile helps you. I mean, if there's anything else, I appreciate that. I just have one sort of basic question because it does concern with something that had been said. But the UN Secretary General had was in Turkmenistan a few weeks ago, and he said the denial of free expression leads to, among other things, a breeding ground for extremist ideologies. Specifically, anyone that would like to take it, and don't have to be a lengthy explanation, but I want to know how significant is that connection that the Secretary General appears to draw between religious repression and Islamic radicalization. Either one of you want to take a stab at that, or just say it's Thursday afternoon and I'll pass. Go ahead.
I'm happy to start with that question. I think that is one of our dominant concerns throughout the region, and specifically in Uzbekistan, that these harsh so-called national security policies, counterterrorist policies, are really cracking down on religious freedom and a fundamental freedom under the masquerade of being an effective counterterrorism policy. What we find I have conducted hundreds of interviews in the last 12 years with people or with families or with lawyers of people who are arrested, tortured, and arbitrarily imprisoned for attending a mosque that isn't on the government-approved list, for possessing banned religious literature, for possessing Qurans, for wearing hijab, a headscarf, or for wearing a beard or a head covering. When when Amnesty did its research, when I was with Amnesty last year doing research for our report on torture in Uzbekistan, we met with some people in Kyrgyzstan, and one of the people that we met with, actually, an older woman, actually broke down in tears, and she said, "Look, you can buy the Quran on the street. You can't do that in Uzbekistan," and as a result, dozens of members of her own family are in prison or have fled the country. The links to radicalization, I think, are very poorly understood. I think it's something that the governments of the region are terrified of. I think it's something that they should rightly be concerned about, but it's their own policies that are driving those dynamics.
Okay. Anything to add, Ms. Kelsey?
I would just add, and I would take it a little bit more broadly than just religious repression, but general repression across the board, is that one of, I think, my abiding frustrations is we and the people running the show in this region look at the same data set. We look at what happened on the Maidan in Ukraine. We look at what happened in Tahrir Square in Tunisia. And we draw the conclusion that this is what happens when you don't provide your country's people with the ability to have a real say in their life, when you cut off oxygen to the population. And they look at the same data set and they say, this is what happened when you don't crack down hard enough. And I think that's sort of the core of the problem we face.
And I think that's one of the biggest issues in this area, and dealing with not only the internal aspects of the Central Asian region, but just in general. And I think I don't have time, and I'm not going to be able to go into it. Our travel changes to scheduling today, but I think there's also an interesting contrast going to be coming down through here. And Mr. Chairman, we'll talk about this more later. Is basically the China influence here, with the Silk Road. New economic belt, this issue of China and flexing its economic muscles in this area, how that will affect the contrast with Russia. I think there's, with our drawing back militarily, however, the instability in that region is going to continue. I think that, for me, the next 5 to 10, if not longer, years, this is going to be a constant area of overall concern in general from the human rights perspective and many other perspectives. So I appreciate the two of you being here. But sir, again, thank you for your smile. Thank you for your perseverance. Thank you for reminding us all that the human spirit is bigger inside than anything that we could ever put words to. And you're a living example of that.
I'd like also add about when I was in the prison, in our colony was about 300 prisoners jailed as extremists, as Islamic extremists, as Muslim extremists. And when they saw what, they know what I lived in United States, my family lived in United States, and they asked many questions about United States, especially when I told them what in United States you may see the church in every 1-2 kilometers. They was happy to hear this. They was happy to know what in United States so many churches. And so this about extremism and about labeling the believers as extremists. And why so many jailed for this religious? Because I think it's like 100 years ago, the firefighters, when they stopped paying for the number of the fight, after that, the number of fight was down. It's similar thing, I think, because they receiving promotion, police. They're receiving promotion of the number of the people what they jailed for the extremist jailed. They're having promotion, they're touching some, I don't know, some maybe money, some prize for this. This is why they are looking to jail just regular people, religious people. and labeling them extremists. But they're not extremists. I don't see extremists inside the jail. I mean,
And what they're trying to do, and actually leads to the very thing that they're claiming to be trying to get against. Again, thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me go, and I appreciate it. I yield back.
Well, thank you all again for being here. And, you know, I think that the challenge for all of us is to try to figure out how we can have a more constructive U.S. foreign policy toward this region that would encourage all the things that we've all been talking about, you know, better human rights, you know, better respect for religious freedom, you know, and to promote, you know, encourage governments that actually treat their people decently. Let me begin by asking you the same question I asked the previous panel, you know, and that is, you know, both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are led by rulers with questionable human rights records. When you think of succession in these countries, is that likely to impact anything? I mean, are there forward-thinking leaders? I know entire systems have to be changed, but I'm trying to figure out who are the leaders who might help change those systems, and do we have any cause for hope, or do we expect more of the same?
Incredibly important and difficult question. I would say a couple of things. Anyone who has risen to a high level in these systems is fairly well bought into the system. I do think that generationally, these new generation of leadership will be different. You know, those of us who are old enough to have worked in the Soviet Union or on the Soviet Union joke that you can take the boy out of the Politburo, but you can't take the Politburo out of the boy. The new generation will not have that experience that Nazarbayev and Karimov had. On the other hand, there's some downside to that. The new generation, particularly in Uzbekistan, actually knows their neighbors far less than the older generation did. So, in fact, I think there's actually some dangers in terms of the impact it will have on intra-regional. Many people think that the only reason that Uzbekistan did not intervene in Kyrgyzstan in 2010 during the violence in the south there was because Karimov decided that. Unclear what a new generation of leaders would. I think that in Kazakhstan you have perhaps somewhat greater institutionalization than you do in Uzbekistan, which gives some greater hope that things will move in a positive direction. On the other hand, I know someone who knows Kazakhstan very well who firmly believes that because there's more money at stake, the battle will be even harder in Kazakhstan than in Uzbekistan. So these will clearly be tremendously important changes, but in what direction is just very hard to say at this point.
Anybody else?
It's, if, for example, it will be generational change, so the very important time will be yes, when old leader will go and new leader will come. This also could be some kind of destabilization at that time, because, as was said, very strong position in these countries have narco traffickers from Afghanistan to Russia and to Europe. And this narco traffic mainly controlled by the people who are in the who have very strong position in the government too. So they could use this situation to destabilize country and to have possibility to transport more drug from Afghanistan to Russia. This is what I wanted to add.
I think what I'm trying to figure out, I think what all of us are trying to figure out are concrete U.S. policies that can actually make a difference, that are actually going to be helpful. Sometimes I feel, especially because of the region that we're talking about, that we have kind of looked the other way too often on human rights abuses and other violations of human dignity because it fit into our priorities in Afghanistan. And this is not the first time. If you look at our history, we've kind of looked the other way with regard to countries that have lousy human rights records, to justify, because they gave us a promise that they'll help us with, a war that we were involved in. And even though we're maybe winding down in Afghanistan, I hear that every year, and yet it doesn't look like we can seem to ever get out of there. I wish we would, but I think it's more likely that we're going to be there a lot longer than people think. And so I appreciate the administration's panel's kind of words of that we care about human rights, we care about religious freedom, we're concerned about these laws regarding the crackdown on the LGBT community. I go, on and on and on. But I kind of feel like we need a more imaginative policy, something a little bit different, because based on what I'm reading, I'm not necessarily convinced that our condemnations or our statements or our words in our human rights report are enough. I mean, that's why I raised the issue about why we were providing Uzbekistan with over 300 MRAPs. And I appreciate all the, assurances that there'll be due diligence and there'll be proper oversight and all that kind of stuff, but it just doesn't strike me as appropriate that we would do something like that. I mean, I'm just looking for some guidance here and concrete things that we can do to actually have a more positive impact on the region. And if any of you want to comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
I'd just like to reiterate one thing I mentioned during my testimony, Congressman, and that is the United States needs to do a better job of speaking out to the population beyond governments in these areas. I mean, if you look at the first opinion polls that came out of Egypt after Mubarak fell and what they said about attitudes towards the United States. And these governments are not forever. Kyrgyzstan's already had 2 governments overthrown. When the Bakiyev government fell, the new government that came in, the new president, Rosa Otunbayeva, former foreign minister, opposition leader, gave an interview for the Washington Post in which she excoriated the U.S. government for refusing to say anything about human rights publicly while the opposition was being punished. So I think in terms of long-term U.S. interests, at the very least, what we need to do is be more open. So, for example, we heard here today about the anti-constitutional nature of President Karimov's 4th now re-election in spite of a 2-term limit. Well, what did the United States government say publicly about that? Very different than what you heard at the table here today, at least as far as the Uzbek population.
What did we say publicly?
As far as I know, there was very little said, actually.
And
I do believe that this may have been the case of Kyrgyzstan. In Vienna at the OSCE, the U.S. government said that it supported the conclusions of the OSCE monitoring mission. But no words about the U.S. having found this election to have been, at its basis, completely lacking in legitimacy. Nothing like that was said.
And what about our embassies and our missions? I mean, do we have human rights advocates going to visit those who have been imprisoned, or meeting with legitimate opposition groups or religious minorities or those groups that are under attack? I mean, are we doing that on a regular basis?
In my experience, many of the embassy staff on the ground have been very effective in that kind of
Good.
Outreach. And as I think Deputy Assistant Secretary Brzezinski said, it tends to play a sort of protective role.
Right.
And we want to take the opportunity to welcome Ambassador Spratling in Tashkent's very strong public statement about the treatment of Elena Orlaeva that I mentioned in my statement. She met with her, was photographed with her, made a statement.
Good.
That kind of thing is important. It sends a signal that the U.S. Cares very much about these activists and what they're working on. But the U.S. can do more of that. That kind of statement, if it's then taken up in Washington, is even stronger and more resonant.
Dr. Umarov?
In my opinion, it is very important to make statement before election, to make statement for the president who want to go for re-election by breaking the Constitution. What United States will not support this re-election because in Uzbekistan, for example, he is looking. Karimov, he's looking first what kind of the reaction in Washington or in other big capitals, what is the reaction? And if there is no reaction, if there is silence, so he decided to go to election. And then after election, okay, it's done. He is re-elected. So it's very important to have strong position before election to make the statement or, I don't know, have some kind of global Magnitsky law who will strongly condemn the broke of the Constitution.
Well, that was going to be my next question, and that is that, for a lot of these people who are entrenched in these various governments who have horrendous human rights records and some who are guilty of corruption, there really isn't any consequence that they face, barring something like a Global Magnitsky Act, barring something that says that, publicly we know who you are, and we have a lot of evidence to prove that you are guilty of, what you've been accused of, and we are going to publicly shame you, and there is a consequence with regard to your ability to travel to our country. And if we wish this were more than a United States, we like the other countries in the region in the world to get on board something like this. But basically, that if you're not going to get justice within your own country, understand that there is a consequence outside of your country, and to start naming the people who are most responsible for some of the worst abuses that we're reading about and that are being documented. And so you would think that would be a helpful development.
Yeah, sure. It's global Magnitsky law will be very helpful for that.
So we originally had a global Magnitsky bill, and then it got narrowed down because, don't ask me why, you're in the United States Congress, but we narrowed it down to Russia specific. But human rights is not something that is of concern just in Russia. It should be a global concern, and I think kind of what frustrates me when we talk about this region of the world is that, like I said, that human rights doesn't seem to be as prominent as it really should be. And again, while we issue reports and statements and all that's very good, it seems that that's just not enough.
Congressman, I just mentioned that you don't need global Magnitsky for the United States to put people on the visa.
We do, but they didn't need it for Russia either. But we did it because if we didn't, we wouldn't have been able to, to get the administration to do what they've been doing. But they can do it on their own.
That not too many months ago, the United States government banned or put on the visa ban list 6 Hungarian officials for corruption. I mean, this is an ally country. So it is more, I would say, at the moment, lack of political will than lack of instrument.
And I think, and part of it is, I think, for us to send, a stronger statement that human rights needs to be central to all of our foreign policies, not just with regard to Russia, but with regard to the whole world. I mean, but you're right. I mean, our argument on Magnitsky was you don't really even need it to do what you're doing. But without it, we wouldn't have the tool to be able to go to the administration and to make the case, that they need to act, and so there are requirements that they have to react every so often. So it is important. But look, I don't want to keep people here. I know you've been here for a long time, but let me just ask you if there's any final things that you want to say for the record, or things that we should know about, or things that we should do. I'd welcome any comments that you might have. No? Okay. Well, let me just say I appreciate all you being here. I appreciate your patience. And Doctor, thank you so much for being here and for telling your story. And it's very important. And we look forward to working with you in the weeks, months, and years ahead. Best of luck. Thank you.